Good evening. My name is Kevin Bergeson, and I am the Patient Education Programs Coordinator for the Colon Cancer Alliance. And on behalf of the Certified Patient Navigators and the entire patient support team from the Colon Cancer Alliance, I would like to welcome you to tonight's webinar, Dehydration Causes Impact on Your Treatment and What Can You Do? This is the sixth segment in the Colon Cancer Alliance's Conversations About Colon Cancer webinar series, which we created to provide the opportunity for patients and survivors, caregivers, family members, friends, and healthcare professionals to link with national experts in colorectal cancer and other related fields in an interactive online setting. As a reminder, these conversations of colon cancer webinar occur every third Wednesday of the month from 7 until 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Before we get too far into the webinar, I wanted to take a moment here to let you all know who are attending that about this time tomorrow, each of you will be receiving an email survey about this webinar. The Colon Cancer Alliance values your opinion and would very much like to hear your honest feedback on how we can make delivery of our webinars better. So please look for that email and take our survey. Help us help you. I'm thanking you in advance. This evening's webinar will be providing excellent information on dehydration and its effect on cancer patients. Next to oxygen, water is the second most important nutrient. Every cell and organ in the body depends on it, and without it, the human body cannot function properly. Colon cancer patients are at a high risk for dehydration and need to assure their body is getting exactly what it needs. From screening to managing treatment, side effects to surgery to survival, being properly hydrated and balancing your electrolytes is important to your successful treatment. This webinar will discuss dehydration and what you can do to balance your electrolytes using oral rehydration to treat dehydration causes by their treatments quickly, effectively, and at home before the symptoms become unbearable. Hey, before I introduce our speaker, a quick note here about questions. We envision this webinar to be interactive where you can pose questions for our presenters. After each speaker has presented their slideshow, we will be able to address a few of your questions during the webinar. Because of the number of attendees and because we are tracking the questions, we're only accepting questions posted online by use of your webinar control panel. To submit a question for consideration and possible use, click on the small plus sign located next to the word questions on the webinar control panel located on the right-hand side of your screens. Then type your question in and hit enter. All questions will be asked on a time-available basis, so accept my apologies in advance if your particular question does not get asked. However, all questions that we are unable to get to, we will be collecting those and following up on those after the webinar with a personal email. And with that, I will introduce our two speakers. It is my pleasure to introduce Chris Shaw and Candace Fleming, the co-founders of H2ORS. Chris and Candace have had over 8 years in oral rehydration solution field. Their current duties at H2ORS include patient education and awareness, along with advocacy group outreach and support. Chris monitors oncology cancer boards and attends oncology nurse navigator, and patient navigator meetings and seminars, as well as patient advocacy events across the nation. Candace assures that the H2ORS plays a key role in ensuring that H2ORS is the only fully World Health Organization compliant oral rehydration solution targeted exclusively for cancer patients and survivors. Together, they research current treatment modalities to understand the often overlooked side effects of dehydration and the effect on patients' well-being outcomes and regime adherence. The sole focus of H2RS and their efforts is towards cancer patients, healthcare providers, and patient support networks. Chris and Candace, welcome, and I'm going to turn it over to you at this time.
Oh, there we go. Let's do that. And there we go. Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Kevin, for doing the introductions for us. We're very, very excited to not only be speaking to you all this evening about dehydration and colorectal cancer, but also incredibly proud to be associated with the Colon Cancer Alliance. We've enjoyed our relationship with you guys, and this is a great opportunity for us to share what is easily one of the most common side effects associated with cancer treatments. And as a way of getting started, talking about the causes of dehydration, it's probably one of the most largely misunderstood symptoms in day-to-day life. It plays a huge role in both physical and emotional well-being. And it's so ubiquitous that it's so present in everyday life that most people take it for granted and fail to realize that they even are going through dehydration. But what's more important is for cancer patients, they tend to be much more vulnerable and much more susceptible to dehydration as a result of a variety of causes. For example, screening. I doubt there's anyone in the audience tonight who hasn't had the fun of going through a colonoscopy. And the number one thing a colonoscopy does is give you diarrhea. And diarrhea is the easiest way to become dehydrated. They're not having you clear your bowel of fluids, they're having you clear your bowel of solids. This is why when you are getting your colonoscopy screening instructions, they allow you to drink water, they allow you to drink teas and clear fluids, because they know the process of prepping for a colonoscopy is going to cause dehydration. And I think just to stop for a moment throughout this conversation that we're going to have tonight, when we're talking about dehydration, there are essentially three clinical states of dehydration. There's mild dehydration, which is clinically defined as a loss of fluid body weight of 2 to 5%. In other words, your total fluid weight is reduced by 2 to 5%. A moderate dehydration state is anywhere from 5 to 10% fluid body weight loss, and severe dehydration is anything above 10%. So for purposes of our conversation, we're talking about mild and moderate dehydration. If you get to the severe dehydration state, you are in an ambulance and on your way for medical intervention. It's nothing that you're going to cure at home. It's a very serious condition. So back to the other causes. So particularly for colorectal cancer patients, there's a lot of screening and testing that goes on that's going to create a dehydration state. And then you've got treatment modalities. It doesn't matter. Chemotherapy, radiation therapy, oral oncolytics. Virtually all of these treatments cause vomiting, nausea, and diarrhea, all three of which are globally the most common ways that people get dehydrated from illness. The third part that affects colorectal patients would be post-treatment. Whether you've had a surgery for an ileostomy or you're a post-treatment cancer survivor, many times the surgery and the post-cancer treatment regimes are going to continue causing dehydration. So there are many, many ways that people become dehydrated, and I'm sure if you have been in treatment or in treatment now, you recognize some of these very, very common colorectal cancer agents. When you start doing the research on the manufacturer's website, there's always a section of the most common side effects, and without fail, nausea and diarrhea are always listed as a common side effect. Vomiting is very prevalent, fatigue is, as is a whole host of other side effects. However, the ones that really matter are vomiting and diarrhea. And we're going to talk a little bit about how, in particular, vomiting and diarrhea can cause dehydration quickly. Some of the everyday things that you deal with that cause dehydration are very Everyday activities like exercise, being out in the sun, traveling, heaven forbid any of us have a glass of wine or a cocktail too many, but that is also another way that people become very dehydrated. And what people fail to realize is that those side effects have a real impact on us. So we talked a little bit about how mild dehydration is clinically defined as losing simply 2% of your fluid body weight. And it's a little bit hard to see in this slide, but when you think about it, if you're a 180-pound man, 60% of your total weight is made up of water. For women, it's 50% of their total body weight. So when you do the calculations, at 2%, a 180-pound man is only losing essentially 2 quarts of fluid, or 35 ounces. For a 120-pound woman, that's as little as 19 ounces of fluid. And the little icons you can see to the right and left of the figurines there are typical 16-ounce bottles of water. They're not very big. When you unfortunately think about the diarrhea that's associated with prepping for a colonoscopy or the vomiting and diarrhea that's brought about by treatment, a single episode of diarrhea can make you clinically dehydrated. So, when you're losing fluids, you're also losing key electrolytes. And it's very important to remember that dehydration is not simply the loss of fluids. It is when you are also losing the electrolytes. And you lose fluid and electrolytes through sweat, through breathing, through exercise, but through urination, through defecation. But then when you start adding in some of the complications associated with treatment, you begin to lose larger amounts of fluids and even more electrolytes. So the clinical term is your body is shedding the fluids and the electrolytes. And it's the combination of the two that cause the problems. Electrolyte replenishment is absolutely critical for recovery. And when we're talking recovery, we're talking about the recovery of dehydration, but we're also talking about the recovery of what's happening in your body post-treatment. And just replacing the fluids with water is simply not enough. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the importance of salt and potassium and chloride a little later in the presentation. But it's very important to remember that simple water alone is not enough to get it done. There are many chemotherapy agents that are very toxic, obviously, for your body, and some of them actually require additional fluids to flush the toxins out of your system to allow your body to recover from the treatment. Again, we just chatted a little bit about water alone will not replenish crucial electrolytes. In effect, when you look at tap water or bottled water, there's a very infinitesimally small amount of sodium and some mineral content. But when you're talking about the amount of electrolytes that are lost very quickly through something like vomiting or diarrhea, simple water alone isn't going to get it done. So, typical side effects or typical symptoms of dehydration you probably all understand very well. You can have a dry or sticky mouth. You might have some dizziness. You could have a headache. Constipation is a very common side effect. But when you dig a little bit deeper, some of the physiological effects on your body from dehydration include increased cardiovascular strain. In other words, as your body becomes dehydrated, there is a thickening of the blood, and your heart is working harder to pump that blood through your system. If you're already in a compromised state because of illness, this is just exacerbating the problem. Your body dissipates its heat through sweating, and you sweat all the time. It's not the type of sweat that you would feel if you're out exercising and your shirt's getting wet or your armpits are moist. But as you go through your life, there's constantly moisture coming to the surface of your skin that evaporates to cool your body. If you reduce the amount of water in your system, you're reducing your body's ability to use those fluids for heat dissipation. Again, as you become dehydrated and there's less fluids available, your central blood volume is reduced, which again goes back to the increased cardiovascular strain. Heat cramps and fatigue cramps are very common in dehydrated people. If you think about athletes, the NBA playoffs are on right now. It's very common for basketball players, who are arguably some of the fittest athletes in the world, yet because of the demands they're putting on their body and the amount of fluid and electrolytes they're losing, it is very typical at halftime for players to be taking IV fluids for preventing and correcting cramps. I promise not to use too many terms like this, but hyponatremia is a condition in your body where there's simply not enough salt. And there are some very, very nasty little side effects and symptoms of hyponatremia, including confusion, fatigue, weakness, muscle weakness, irritability. And these are all some of the side effects or symptoms of hyponatremia. Lastly, when you are able to exercise or you are in an environment that requires cardiovascular strain, when you're dehydrated, your body temperature rises faster and to a higher rate than it would normally do in a hydrated state. So some of these things may seem like, well, does that really affect me? It actually does. When you think about what's happening to your body and fighting and treating your disease, all of these bullet points we're talking about are exacerbated in cancer patients. Some of the psychological effects of dehydration are incredibly interesting to think about and talk about. And this, I think, is one of the key points of our conversation tonight, because I don't know anyone who's having a great time going through their disease process. And dehydration plays such an important role on your emotional well-being, and they're very well understood. Dehydration causes moodiness or irritability. All right. When you think about a very well-known energy drink that comes in a very small bottle and it's in every convenience store across the world, it seems like, their online and radio advertising is always talking about the 3 o'clock crash. That 3 o'clock crash has more to do with dehydration than it does with your energy level. And the moodiness and irritability that comes along with that, so many people are associating with, well, I have cancer and I'm depressed, damn it, and I'm unhappy. Some of that can be ascribed to being dehydrated. Dehydration causes a decrease in mental vigilance. There was a couple of very interesting studies done at the University of Connecticut, and they were studying the effects of mild dehydration on healthy women and healthy male athletes. And they put them through a whole series of tests on psychological factors. And one of the ones that popped out was their not lack thereof, but a decrease in their ability to maintain mental vigilance through tests or tasks. Dehydrated people get more headaches. There is a link between dehydration as a trigger for migraine headaches that's being studied at several universities, including our local university here in California, Stanford. Dehydration causes an increased perception of the level of effort it takes to complete a task. One of the things that we end up talking a lot about with cancer patients is, I just don't want to drink that much water. I don't have the energy for it. I don't feel like doing it. I just don't want to. Well, again, as you become dehydrated, simple tasks seem to require more and more effort to get it done. If you want to take that into the workplace, it's that same notion that it's after lunch, it's 3 o'clock, it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Do you really feel like making the extra phone call or grinding out another spreadsheet? Dehydration will cause a slowing in your short-term memory. Dehydration causes a reduction in your reaction time. And again, remember, most of these bullet points were done on healthy people, healthy young women, healthy young men who are athletes. And when you extrapolate that into a compromised position of being in cancer treatment, these symptoms simply just get worse. Lastly, there is a reduction in fine motor skills. I know that a lot of the drugs that people listening to the webinar tonight take are going to cause neuropathy and other issues. So is hydration going to completely eliminate those conditions? No, it's not. However, it's a contributing factor to these motor skills degradation. And before we move off this slide, I wanted to touch again on the University of Connecticut, who conducted these studies. And while we have established that clinically mild dehydration is defined at 2% of fluid body weight loss, the study in Connecticut, both studies, were finding that these symptoms that are on the screen in front of you now were taking place as low as 1.6 or 1.7% fluid body weight loss. So it is incredibly simple to become dehydrated and start having the symptoms and the effects of dehydration impact your day-to-day life. What are we going to do about it? There's any number of options out there, and some of them are effective, some of them are not. It's important to remember that almost any fluids are good fluids, all right? Whether those fluids are coming in the form of a beverage you're consuming, or soup, or even in moist foods, it all counts, all right? There are some things that might be better than others, and we can get into some of the minutia about it. But if at the end of this presentation you say, hey, Chris, that was great, however, I like drinking pickle juice, then drink pickle juice, because, again, you need to have the fluids in your system. Water. Water is the mainstay of hydration. We talked a little bit about how water is very useful. However, in terms of patients who are having active vomiting or active diarrhea, you have to remember that you're shedding an incredible amount of electrolytes. And we can pause here for a second and talk about electrolytes. Electrolytes are very, very simple. I don't want to overcomplicate it. It's salt, it's potassium, it's chloride, it's magnesium. The list kind of goes on and on and on. The most important ones being sodium, chloride, and potassium. All right. One of the issues that is going to be present in a couple of these bullet points is absorption rates and what happens if you have active vomiting or active diarrhea. Fruit juices. A lot of times people want to drink a fruit juice because it's comforting, it's sweet, it tastes good. There's not a lot of nutritional value in it. If you can keep it down and it's what you want to drink, I think it's what you should drink. You should get fluids into your system. The problem with most fruit juices is they have a very high sugar content. And we're going to, as we move through these bullet points, start talking more and more about the effects of sugar and complex sugars in what you drink. Sports drinks, very, very common. As Candace and I go around the country talking not only to patients and advocacy groups, we spend a huge amount of time chatting with infusion nurses, oncology nurses, nurse navigators, radiation oncologists, hemoncs, medical oncologists, and it's surprising to us how often sports drinks come up. Remember that sports drinks are essentially anything in a bottle that says sports drink on it. So there is no true definition, and they cover everything from sugar-free energy drinks to high fructose corn syrup with electric colors and no electrolytes. There's no, it's easier to call your product organic, or it's easier to call your product a sports drink than it is to call it organic. So we'll talk a little bit more about sports drinks in the upcoming slides. Enhanced waters, vitamin water, coconut water, you name it, they're all out there. Usually enhanced waters in the beverage industry are defined as anything that's not water that's been flavored or enhanced to increase its palatability or its marketability. By and large, not a lot of nutritional value in enhanced water relative to what someone that's going through cancer treatments would need, but I'm going to emphasize it again. If your favorite thing to drink and you can drink it and keep it down is an enhanced water, that's way more important than almost anything else. Intravenous fluids. It is perhaps in the United States the single most effective way of treating mild to moderate dehydration for patients going through cancer treatments. I'm not telling anyone listening to this webinar something that they probably don't know much better than I do. When Candace and I were at the Oncology Nursing Society Congress, their annual meeting in Orlando, Florida, a couple of weeks ago, we sat there and spoke to hundreds and hundreds of nurses. And one of the most common, and I don't mean to make light of this, but things that they would joke about is the 48-hour post-treatment bounce back. And I think you all know it very well, and they certainly do. They know if they're going to hit you with a round of chemo, that realistically within 48 hours, a very large percentage of all of their patients are going to be back in the infusion center for simple IV fluids. The downside of that is that if that 48-hour mark happens to hit on a weekend or a night or a holiday, now the patient is stuck going either to the emergency room or a ready care center, or even worse, toughing it out and making it through to the next business day where they can go in and get treated. Now, the other interesting thing, and all of you who have gone through this process understand all too well, is that normally a trip back to the infusion center or the emergency room requires, at that point, a phone call, not only to the infusion center to say, can I come in, but then to a spouse, a family member, a neighbor, a friend to drive you. Then there's the wait. Then there's the needle stick, which involves the risk of infection. Then there's the time involved. But at the end of all of that, those of you who have gone through that generally feel on top of the world. You go from this horrible feeling of, I am miserable, I don't want to do this anymore, I don't want my next round of treatments, to, I just got 2 liters of fluid and now I can walk on water. And that's a very bad pun. But the effects of rehydrating and replacing the fluid and electrolytes in a moderately or mildly dehydrated patient cannot be underestimated. And it was very much a common touch point for us in talking to the oncology nurses. Now, we move on to oral rehydration solution. It is perhaps the first time many of you are hearing this term. Don't feel odd about that, because one of the things that we understand all too well is there's no shortage of information when you've got cancer. It comes at you electronically, it comes at you verbally, it comes at you from friends, families, neighbors, doctors, nurses, advocacy groups. There's no shortage of it. The interesting thing is when Candace and I stand in a hospital or at a nursing meeting or an advocacy group, even the medical professionals are going, what's oral rehydration solution? So that is a great question. When you look at the hydration landscape, there are essentially 3 different categories, and we're talking about things that you can take by mouth and drink. We have sports drinks. The problem with sports drinks is effectively they're non-functional. They generally contain either too much sugar or no sugar, and very, very few of them contain any meaningful amounts of electrolytes. Some of these sports drinks will have high fructose corn syrup in them. Most of them are going to have sucrose, fructose, complex sugars. And I'm going to stop here because this is very important. If you have vomiting or if you have diarrhea, when you consume a product that has either an excess of sugar or complex sugars, table sugar, which is sucrose, or fructose, or heaven forbid, an artificial sugar like a high fructose corn syrup, your body must take fluid out of the bloodstream and pull it into your digestive tract or your gut. And the reason your body does that is to break that sugar down so that it can be absorbed or digested as it travels your small intestine. Now, when you drink that fluid and your body pulls fluid out of your bloodstream to digest it, and you have got active vomiting or active diarrhea, where do you think those fluids are going to go? They're not going to travel the small intestine to be slowly absorbed over time. They're either coming out the front door or they're going out the back door. So that's a very important thing to think about when you're in that kind of state and you need to get fluids into your system. Oops, wrong way. Let's go this way. Electrolyte drinks. We are all familiar with them. Most of them are pediatric in nature. Some of them are geriatric in nature. They are functional. They generally contain relevant amounts of electrolytes. The problem with them is that they tend to not taste very good. If any of you out there think Pedialyte is just the rock star of all drinks in the world, God bless you. I can't get my kids to drink it. Another in that category would be something like coconut water, or I brought it up earlier, pickle juice. These all tend to have large amounts of electrolytes. Coconut water and pickle juice tend to be very high either on magnesium or potassium, not high on sodium or chloride. Again, because of the way those drinks are constructed, they have a slow absorption rate. It's not slower than anything else, but they must travel your entire small intestine and be absorbed over time. So at the top of this pyramid is oral rehydration solution. And you got to bear with me a little bit here, because if you were to step outside of the United States, oral rehydration solution is incredibly well understood. It is not a new product. It doesn't matter if you go to Asia, Latin America, Europe, Canada, for Pete's sake, Africa, and say, I've got food poisoning, I've got the flu, I've got this. The pharmacist will tell you, you just need to drink some oral rehydration solution, and you'll be right. And the reason for that is that oral rehydration solution is medically proven to be an alternative to IV fluids for treating mild to moderate dehydration. And here's the key point. An oral rehydration is absorbed into your bloodstream so rapidly that even if you have active vomiting or active diarrhea, the fluids and the electrolytes are absorbed before your body can shed them. And we'll get into some of the details on that as we move through some of these slides. Here are some of the parts about an oral rehydration solution that are worth knowing. It's not new. The World Health Organization invented oral rehydration solution over 40 years ago, and it's used primarily for treating fluid-shedding diseases like cholera or dysentery, and most recently in the news, Ebola, right? A simple Google of cholera treatment, dysentery treatment, Ebola treatment is going to lead you to oral rehydration solution. Now, there's been a lot of push lately about Ebola vaccines, yet those are not approved yet. And one of the reasons the World Health Organization developed ORS for treating these diseases is that generally cholera and dysentery and Ebola are happening in parts of the world where there's not enough IV fluids available, or that IV fluids are too expensive to deploy, and mostly because they don't have enough qualified personnel to administer IV fluids. And just as a definition in here, dysentery is essentially bloody diarrhea. So if you're in a chronic diarrhea area, dysentery is generally a big part of that disease process. And you don't die from cholera and dysentery and Ebola because of the disease. You die because your body can no longer retain fluids or electrolytes. And without fluids and without electrolytes, your body eventually shuts down and dies. So ORS has been used literally millions of times in millions of patients over the last 40 years and continues to be used today for treating these diseases outside the United States. Common diseases, childhood gastroenteritis, food poisoning, you name it, any of the things that are going to give you vomit or diarrhea. And again, it was developed as an alternative to IV fluids. What makes it work? And ORS, and this is the science part of it here, so, put the tinfoil hat on and tune in, and I'll get through this stuff, and it's all going to be good, I promise. When you take right amounts of sodium and glucose, and in our case, for the product that we manufacture, it's dextrose. Dextrose and glucose are synonymous. Those are called monosaccharides, which are blood sugars. And glucose and dextrose are absorbed into your bloodstream. If you had a teaspoon of dextrose and you put it into your mouth, that dextrose gets absorbed through your gums. It's so fast. So in the correct rate of glucose, sugar, as what's known as a co-transport. It literally takes the sodium molecule along with two of the molecules, co-transports it from the very beginning of your small intestine directly into the bloodstream. All right. The technical term of that part of your body is the jejunum, in case anybody is really important to understand that co-transport your body can get rid of the fluids. And what happens is that you're going to bring this excess of salt into your bloodstream. And where salt goes, water follows. And what happens is the sodium and the glucose get transported through some proteins in the jejunum, and then the water is literally sucked or pulled via an osmotic imbalance across the, here's one of those terms again, epithelial wall, which is the wall that separates your gut essentially from the bloodstream. So it's that absorption defines what an oral rehydration solution is. Allows nurses to treat people with vomiting and diarrhea with it, as opposed to electrolyte level. IV fluids. We've talked about the near instantaneous rate of an ORS. This is the interesting. Rapid means leaves your stomach. Well, obviously it's important if you have vomiting or diarrhea, active diarrhea. But for patients who have complications because of a surgery, or for patients who have a feeding tube, well, like a day tube or a PEG, what it means is if you drink the fluids, it empties your stomach quickly so you don't have a bloated or a sloshy feeling. Cyclist or a runner or doing some sort of a sport that involves motion is that they can drink fluid. It gets absorbed very quickly. Here are some nutritional comparisons, and I don't want to upload because osmolarity is nothing more than a measurement of solutes, I mean soluble items in fluid, whether it's sugar or salt or other things that will dissolve into fluid. For comparison purposes, your blood generally is going to run anywhere from 270 to 300 in the osmolarity. A very quick comparison when you going to hurry in other words so comparison. There's a range of values that hydration solution must meet to be considered World Health Organization. And yes, we use in terms of being able to deliver clinically relevant amounts of electrolytes, very short. Chloride as a molecule, again, very, very difficult to hide the taste. But when it was first invented, it was being an oral hydration solution. It was loaded with sodium, chloride, and potassium. But what a very, very intelligent person figured out is if we take the salt out of the product and add a lot of sugar to it and make it a really bright and vibrant color, the bank. And God bless them, they did it. Point I want here, citrate. Citrate is essentially a blood acidification. In other words, the rise of acids within your blood. the nasty thing, probably the most common one that all of us are familiar with would be muscle. All frequent sips will stay down. If you have active vomiting or diarrhea and you try and drink an entire liter of it, you're probably going to have some trouble. But small and frequent sips, it will stay down. Our whole goal is that patients consume an oral rehydration solution before they go for treatment, and as in the 48 hours after treatment, they can avoid the need to return to a hospital for IV hydration. An ORS is an over-the-counter product. It effectively puts you in control of managing the dehydration side effects. Again, it can be used proactively rather than waiting until you feel have headaches, cramps. It's something that you can use now. It's over the counter. It's incredibly inexpensive. A single serving of an oral rehydration solution is the same price that you would pay for a sports drink. So the takeaway points, which are going to be posted on the Colon Cancer Alliance website in their blog, is that your treatments are likely to cause dehydration. That dehydration gets worse with each bout of vomiting or diarrhea. It's very, very common. Symptoms of dehydration are used with cancer treatment side effects. They don't have to be. The cancer treatment's going to cause the vomiting and the diarrhea, yes, but the vomiting and the diarrhea are going to cause a whole host of side effects that you can manage at home by yourself. Using an ORS at home is going to help maintain your proper fluid and electrolyte balances, and maintaining fluid and electrolyte balance is going to lessen the side effects. ORS is as fast and effective for treating mild to moderate dehydration as IV fluids. ORS is new. We've already talked about it being well understood outside. It is effective, and it is expensive. For taking along, this is the last. Our product and you can see on the right there are the that need to be called an ORS by the World Health Organization, and yet still a 4-year-old girls, and they love the product. I did my usual ramble. I apologize for that. Get me with some questions.
What we're going to do is open them up for questions here. I'm going to change back over to my screen here temporarily, and our first question comes to us from Sandra. And Sandra would like to know, how do I know when I'm well hydrated?
The simplest measure, and I apologize for not having a better one, is the color of your urine. A properly hydrated person's urine is going to be very clear and very slightly yellow. Other than that, the only hydration tests involve a trip to the doctor's office and a blood sample. So again, if you're urinating frequently and that urine is coming out dark yellow or feels viscous, i.e. sticky, chances are you're dehydrated. You know, in a normal healthy person, drinking a couple of glasses of water a day is going to get it done if they're not exercising or being exposed to elements. But again, when you start accumulating things that cause dehydration is when the fluid and electrolyte needs need to go up.
Okay, very good. I have another question here from Anthony, and he would like to know, are cramps more likely when your body's at rest, like right before bed? And when should these cramps be brought to a doctor's attention?
This is a great question, and I'm more than happy to have a very long conversation about this offline, but the answer goes along these lines. It depends on what's causing the cramps. For example, an athlete or someone that's exercising that gets a cramp in the middle of exercising or very quickly afterwards, those cramps are usually acidosis, a buildup of acid in the blood, and a lack of fluid and electrolytes, and are generally very quickly resolved, either with IV fluids or with an oral rehydration solution. Candace and I live here in Northern California. Running, cycling, triathletes are very, very common. It's very typical if I'm out on a bike ride and you see somebody laying on the side of the ground grabbing their quad or their calf because they've got cramps, they can drink a half a liter and hop back up on their bike and go. Cramps that occur at night or at rest can have any number of triggers to them. My answer to when should you go see a doctor about it would be depending upon the frequency of those cramps and your ability to treat them. If you tried an oral rehydration solution and it resolved it effectively, obviously there's no real reason to go there. But if you've tried a couple of true remedies for that and they're still recurring, absolutely it's time to see a doctor.
Okay. Carol Ann had some questions, but she wanted to know when would she know that she's had enough fluids to prevent hydration? I think you might have addressed that in your previous question.
Yeah, I think so. I think
okay.
I think the trick there, Carol, is staying ahead. It's much easier to stay ahead of your fluid and electrolyte needs than it is to recover from them, because again, those of you who are going through treatment, when you've already had several bouts of diarrhea or vomiting, you just don't feel like putting things into your system because it's going to come back out. But I do want to pause, and I don't mean to take up question time here, so I'm going to go very, very quickly. Small, frequent sips of any fluids is the key to success. And particularly when you've got active vomiting or active diarrhea, something like an oral rehydration solution can become a self-rewarding cycle. You take one sip, you wait 5 minutes, it stays down. You take another sip, you wait 5 minutes, it stays down. That starts accumulating and you start getting better. In other words, you start rewarding yourself for feeling better by drinking more fluids. So, next question.
All right. There is a question from Nicole who's asking, should potassium and magnesium and other vitamins be taken as well? If so, how much is recommended?
Wow. That really is a question for a nutritionist. Okay. And, if you don't already have a integrative team, Candace and I would encourage you to have that team. And what I mean by that is next time you're seeing your doctor, it's like, I need to talk to the nutritionist about what's going on here, or I want to talk to, the navigator, because that's your team. So I'm not trying to duck your question. I can say that one of the reasons that magnesium is not included in an oral rehydration solution is magnesium acts as a sodium inhibitor. It slows the uptake or the absorption gradient of sodium in that whole sodium glucose cotransport thing. I would talk to the nutritionist about how much is enough, how much is too much. And we love those questions and would love nothing more than to talk to your nutritionist about it or provide them information.
Okay, we only have time for a couple, 2 or 3 more questions, and we're going to be out of time.
I'll go fast.
A couple follow-up questions here regarding oral rehydrating solution. Is it going to be okay for diabetics, and how does the glucose in the oral rehydration solution affect those with diabetes? So it's a diabetes-centric question.
Great question. Love the question. All right, so as a diabetic, you know that dextrose and glucose are blood sugars, and if you are monitoring your blood sugar levels, an oral rehydration solution, and ours comes in a stick pack, it's 11 grams of powder in this easy open stick. It's the kind of thing that you can have in your briefcase, in your purse, in your car, in your backpack, that if you get into one of those deficit situations, it's a very, very quick way of restoring sugar levels. But again, for diabetics, it's one of those things that you have to monitor your blood sugar levels, and oral rehydration solution can be an effective part of the toolkit.
And a quick question from Don, who'd like to know if the high citrate level has been shown to prevent coagulation.
Yes. However, I think and this is great. Thank you for bringing this up, Don, because I was errant in not bringing this thing up. So specifically to citrate, you have to have some incredibly high levels of citrate to run into coagulation issues. More often than not, and this comes back to the important point I should have made earlier in our conversation, which is if you know that you are prone to coagulation issues, this is definitely something to discuss with your healthcare team. The same is said for people who are on sodium-restricted diets or people who have, kidney issues, heart issues, and I hate sounding like I've got a lawyer standing over my shoulder saying, well, you got to, make sure you tell everybody that they shouldn't do anything without talking to everybody under the sun about this. But at the end of the day, if you know you have these issues, it's a very simple thing to walk in and say, here's what I've got. Or email us, and I'm sorry, Kevin, I'm going to do the very quick plug here, because if you want more information, we're going to make it available on the CCA website, but you can hit us at info@h2ors.com. We're happy to share information with you. We are more than happy to provide information to nutritionists, to doctors, to nurses, to family, because one of the things that we're most proud about in our company is the level of science and research and published studies on oral rehydration solution that we have used for building this product, and it stands up very, very well. And the last one is, I don't want to cut you off, is we're also happy through the Colon Cancer Alliance to provide samples of the product. We're going to have a link on their website. If it's not there yet, you can just email us again at info@h2ors.com. Give us your name and your address. We're going to send it to you free. You can try the product. We'll send along some collateral that you can share with your team, and you can go from there. Do we have time for another question?
Last question, and I apologize to Sandra, Marcia, and Heather, and any other folks we didn't get to, but we will reach out to those persons who asked questions but did not hear them answered, and we will answer those on a one-on-one email. Last question, Chris, is a number of folks, about 4 of them, were asking where they could get it other than the free link. Well, where is this available?
Fabulous. Okay. So the way we have approached distribution on this, the absolute fastest and easiest way to get the product is to go on to Amazon. If you have Amazon Prime, it's going to show up free. You can get it through our website. We use very low-cost shipping on the product. What we do in terms of bricks and mortar pharmacy distribution is when we have a hospital or a cancer center that is sampling the product to their patients or are actively involved with oral rehydration solution, then we'll go into that area and target their local pharmacies. But because it's such a relatively new product in the United States, the idea of trying to get it in every pharmacy is a mountain too tall. So Amazon.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank everyone for all their questions, but we're out of time. But before we go, I want to remind everybody to join us next month when we will have our 7th and 8th webinars in our Conversations webinar series. The Never Too Young Coalition's presentation of my story, Colon Cancer Before 50, is scheduled for June 16th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That's out of cycle. It's not on a Wednesday, so make a note of that. This will be the first in a 4-part series focused on young onset colorectal cancer, and will focus on the experiences of young onset colorectal cancer survivors before they were diagnosed with colon cancer. Join us and better understand why you're never too young for colon cancer. Our second webinar on June 17th at 7 o'clock Eastern Standard Time is Colorectal Cancer, What's New and What's on the Horizon. Over the past year, there's been big news in colorectal cancer, including new, FDA-approved drugs and treatments, options for patients. And we all want to know what's next. So to find out, please join us in this free patient webinar to find out the latest trending information coming out of the American Society of Clinical Oncology, also known as ASCO annual meeting that would have just occurred, regarding treatment, research, patient care, and much more. As mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, the Colon Cancer Alliance really wants to hear from you on how we can make the delivery of these webinars better. So look for our survey feedback email tomorrow. I promise it will be easy, 5-minute survey. Please feel free to provide any feedback you have. Be brutally honest, as it will really help us ensure we're offering the very best in our webinar services to you and to the survivor community. Of course, if you don't care to wait till tomorrow, you can take a screenshot now, click on that link right there, and give us a survey right away. Thank you in advance. We're very grateful for your feedback. And finally, thanks everybody for attending. We sincerely hope you enjoyed this webinar and you found it informative. As a reminder, this webinar has been recorded and will be available for viewing within a week of the broadcast at ccalliance.org/webinars. That's on our website under our Conversations webinar tab. You can also check out the 5 top webinar takeaways and other relevant materials on our blog at ccalliance.org/blog. And as always, you can always share your comments directly with me at kbergerson@ccalliance.org. So on behalf of the Colon Cancer Alliance and tonight's presenter, I'd like to thank Chris and Candace for presenting. Thank you, Chris and Candace, for being here.
Loved it.
And we look forward to working with you in the future. I hope everyone found it value added and informative. And at this time, I'd like to wish everyone a great evening. Thank you for attending, and take care, everyone.